His own son laughed as if watching a comedy show while a 67-year-old father was mocked and stripped of dignity at the lawyer's table. The stepson sneered, convinced he had taken everything, while the son's nervous chuckle cut even deeper than a knife. Imagine sitting in silence as the people you raised turned your life's work into a cruel joke, dismissing you as nothing more than an old fool with a few plants. But the laughter wouldn't last long. What came next would shatter their arrogance forever. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from to see how this story unfolds. Richard leaned across the polished oak table, his smirk dripping with venom, his voice slicing through the stale air of the lawyer's office. He whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear that the old man could sell roses to buy bread. His words were sharp, mocking a dagger wrapped in false humor. Clara, always eager to echo her husband's cruelty, let out a laugh that rattled with disdain. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her legs, and quipped about how he might enjoy living above some flea market peddling flowers to strangers for pocket change. Even Linda, Mark's wife, who had once thanked him for paying off their hospital bills after the birth of her child, tilted her head and gave the smallest nod of approval, as if the insult was an undeniable truth. And Mark, his own son, sat there, eyes darting from face to face, lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to raise his voice in defense. That silence cut deeper than the laughter. It wasn't just indifference. It was complicity. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the weight of 100 wills read before this one pressing down like a curse. The afternoon light bled through the blinds, slicing shadows across the table, casting each face in harsh lines. The laughter felt louder in that dim light, bouncing off the walls, pounding in his chest. They weren't just mocking him. They were burying him alive, turning his decades of sacrifice into a punchline. He thought of the nights he had worked late, the sweat that soaked his shirts, the backaches that never left. He thought of birthdays, missed promises, postponed, all for the businesses they now treated as spoils of war. And now his son, the boy he once carried on his shoulders through county fairs, sat silently, allowing the humiliation to deepen like a knife twisting in the wound. Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the world bent to his will. He tapped the table with his knuckles and said that maybe the old man could open a roadside stand, something quaint, something people could pity. Clara laughed again, her voice shrill, bouncing off the ceiling. She painted the picture with cruel detail, him hunched over in a folding chair, sun beating down, holding out wilted bouquets, while cars sped past without stopping. The image landed like a hammer, meant to reduce him to nothing but a relic, a failure. And still Mark said nothing. He remembered the first time he taught Mark how to hammer a nail straight, steadying his small hands and whispering encouragement. He remembered staying up nights with Mark when fever gripped the boy, cooling his forehead with damp cloths until morning. He remembered saving every spare dollar to send him to college, even selling off the very tools he used to build his life. And yet here Mark sat mute, his silence screaming louder than any insult. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his lips tightening, his pen frozen above the papers. He had seen greed before, but there was something poisonous about this room, something that made the air thick. Richard noticed and doubled down, telling everyone that men who outlived their usefulness should step aside with dignity. Clara clapped her hands together, delighted at her husband's cruelty, and Linda's silence became a second betrayal. The father sat still, his jaw locked, his fists clenched under the table where no one could see, his heart hammered against his ribs. Not with weakness, but with a gathering storm. Every sound was magnified, the ticking of the clock on the wall, the creak of Richard's chair as he leaned back with satisfaction, the rustle of papers as Clara adjusted her purse with deliberate smugness. Each sound etched itself into memory, each moment burning into a ledger that would never be forgotten. They believed they had already won, that the old man was beaten, powerless, humiliated. They mistook his silence for surrender. Inside he was cataloging every word, every glance, every betrayal. Richard's arrogance, Clara's laughter, Linda's nod, Mark's silence, all of it written in stone. His eyes flicked to the stack of documents the lawyer guarded so carefully, the papers that held truths no one in the room expected. He sat straighter, inhaled deeply, and let the cruelty wash over him like a tide. It stung, but it did not drown him. Instead, it carved something harder, colder, unshakable. Richard leaned forward once more as if he hadn't twisted the knife enough and said that maybe the old man could take up gardening lessons for children, something safe for someone his age. Clara tilted her head and added, or maybe a retirement home with a little patch of soil to keep him busy. The laughter roared again, filling the room like fire consuming dry wood. The father stared at his son, searching for even a flicker of resistance, a spark of loyalty. But Mark avoided his gaze, eyes fixed on the table as though the grain of the wood held all the answers he didn't want to give. The humiliation had reached its peak, the moment when cruelty becomes unbearable, when silence threatens to shatter into rage. But he didn't move. Not yet. His stillness was not weakness. It was precision, a calm before the strike. The storm inside him had found its center. He knew something they didn't. Something that would tear their laughter apart and leave them trembling in its wake. The lawyer cleared his throat, the sound sharp as a blade cutting through the noise. Richard stopped mid-laugh, his grin faltering for just a second. Clara's hand froze on her glass of water. Even Linda's expression shifted uneasy. The father's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, not of joy, but of inevitability. They had written him off as a relic, but the truth sitting in that pile of papers was about to redraw the battlefield. The game they thought they had won was only beginning, and the next revelation would silence the room in a way no insult ever could. The laughter was still bouncing off the walls when the sound of wood cracking under a sudden blow shattered the air. Mr. Harris's hand came down hard on his desk, the echo slicing through their mockery like a guillotine. The smirks froze, Clara's sharp laugh died in her throat, and Richard's swagger faltered for the first time. Even Mark's nervous chuckle snapped into silence. The room seemed to shrink, every shadow on the wall closing in every creak of the old building holding its breath. The lawyer leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate, and merciless. He said the words like a judge passing sentence. The businesses were never in Richard's name, nor the late wife's. For 25 years they had belonged to the father sitting quietly at the end of the table, the man they had just ridiculed as nothing more than a burden. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Richard's lips parted, but no sound came out. His confidence bled away in an instant, leaving only pale skin and wide eyes. Clara shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around her glass knuckles white. Linda lowered her gaze as if hoping to disappear into the carpet. Mark finally lifted his head, his face a mix of shock and something else, fear maybe or shame, though not enough of it. The father didn't move. He let the revelation hang in the air, let it slice them open with its truth. He sat back steady as a stone, eyes sharp as steel. The humiliation they had thrown at him only moments ago now twisted back, cutting into them instead. Mr. Harris continued pulling out files, contracts, receipts, all stamped and dated, each one a nail, sealing the coffin of their arrogance. The late wife had been the public face, yes, but the authority, the power, the ownership, it had always been his. Every signature that mattered bore his name. Every decision that built the empire they thought they had inherited had flowed through his hands. Richard tried to recover, clearing his throat, fumbling for words, but his voice cracked under the weight of the truth. He asked if there was some mistake, if perhaps the lawyer had misread the documents. Harris's eyes narrowed, his tone colder than stone. There was no mistake. The father had been the sole owner for decades. Richard's bravado drained away, leaving him small, almost pathetic, his words collapsing into stammers. Clara touched his arm, but the gesture was hollow, her earlier laughter replaced by unease. The father's silence was not the silence of weakness anymore. It was the silence of dominance, the silence of a man who had nothing left to prove. He studied their faces, watched the blood drain from them, savoring the shift. The predators, so smug, so sure of themselves, were suddenly cornered animals, realizing too late that the ground beneath them had been pulled away. Mark leaned forward, his voice unsteady, asking if this was true, if everything had really belonged to his father. Harris laid another document flat on the desk, sliding it across with deliberate calm. Mark's eyes scanned the lines, his shoulders sagging as he read his father's name again and again. He swallowed hard, but the words he wanted to say never left his lips. The father didn't look at him. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke louder than any accusation. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. Cars passing, footsteps echoing down the hallway. But inside that room, the air was different. It was charged, heavy, suffocating. Richard leaned back his chair, groaning under the sudden shift of his weight. His arrogance was gone, stripped bare by a single revelation. Clara's polished smile cracked lines of worry etching deep around her mouth. Linda's hands trembled slightly, her eyes darting toward Mark, searching for direction, but finding none. The father inhaled slowly, his chest rising with quiet control. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than their panic, his presence heavier than their shame. Mr. Harris closed the folder with a snap, the sound final, irrevocable. The truth was no longer a secret. It was a weapon, and it had already struck its first blow. Richard tried again, his voice strained, asking if there was a way to contest it, some loophole, some angle that might undo the revelation. Harris didn't flinch. His words cut sharp. The documents were airtight. The ownership was beyond dispute. The father's power was not new. It had been there all along, waiting patient, hidden until the right moment. And now it had risen, undeniable. The weight of betrayal shifted in the room. A moment ago they had mocked him, dismissed him as powerless. Now they were the ones exposed, stripped of the illusions they clung to. Mark leaned back, rubbing his forehead, the shame creeping in, but not enough to undo his silence from before. Clara's eyes darted to the door as if escape might save her from the humiliation pressing down. Richard's jaw clenched, his hands trembling despite his effort to hide it. The father finally moved. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, slow, deliberate, a small gesture, but one that radiated control. His eyes met Richard's, holding him there, pinning him like prey. No words passed his lips, but the message was clear. You thought me weak. You thought me blind. You thought me finished. You were wrong. The tension in the room grew unbearable. Even the ticking clock seemed louder, heavier, dragging each second into eternity. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by the echo of their own downfall. They shifted in their seats, restless, uncomfortable, but the father sat calm, steady, unshaken. Mr. Harris leaned back, his voice calm but edged with authority. He told them that this was only the beginning, that there was more to reveal. The father's empire was larger, deeper, stronger than they ever imagined. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, the words lost before they began. Clara looked at him, her earlier smugness now hollow, brittle. Linda avoided eye contact altogether. Mark finally whispered a single word, barely audible but enough to echo. How? The father's faint smile returned, colder, this time sharper. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. The lawyer reached for another file, thicker, heavier, filled with truths still waiting to be unleashed. What came next would not only silence their laughter forever, but leave them shattered, facing a reckoning they had never prepared for. Mr. Harris slid a thick folder across the desk, the weight of it echoing like a gavel strike. He opened it with deliberate precision, pages whispering as he turned them one by one, each sheet a blade slicing through the lies that had built the arrogance in that room. The documents bore signatures, seals, and dates stretching back decades. Contracts with banks, deeds to properties, testimonies from partners, all pointing to a single truth. The late wife's name had been on the surface a figurehead for appearances, but the authority had always been his. Every decision that kept the empire alive had been signed, sealed, and approved by the father they had mocked only minutes earlier. Richard's smirk had already crumbled, but now his face drained to the color of ash. His hand twitched, restless, reaching as though he could snatch the papers from the desk and tear them apart, but he didn't move. Clara leaned forward, her breath-shallow eyes scanning the signatures she couldn't refute. Linda swallowed hard, her fingers twisting in her lap. Mark leaned back, the weight of realization crashing down on him like a wave. The father had not been a silent passenger in their lives. He had been the driver guiding the wheel with steady hands they had all ignored. The lawyer's voice was merciless, steady as stone. He read off dates of expansions, approved investments made, properties acquired, all with the father's signature inked in black. Loans they believed had come from their mother's negotiations had been his choice's risks. He had carried alone victories he had secured without fanfare. He had allowed his wife to hold the spotlight, to be the face that greeted bankers and shook hands at ribbon cuttings, but every path behind the curtain had led to him. For 25 years his son and stepson had been laboring under his command, working within the boundaries of his empire, and they had never even realized it. The humiliation in the room shifted into something heavier. Richard's eyes darted to the window as though searching for escape, but the walls seemed to close in, sealing him inside his own downfall. Clara pressed her lips together, her earlier mockery dissolving into silence that reeked of panic. Linda's cheeks flushed, shame staining her skin, though she hadn't spoken much. Mark sat frozen, hands folded tightly, staring at the papers as though they were tombstones marking the death of his illusions. The father sat still, but inside him surged a quiet fire. He remembered the long nights spent at the dining table, with nothing but a lamp and stacks of paperwork. He remembered the sweat-soaked mornings, the handshakes that turned into risks, the sacrifices made when others slept soundly. He remembered shielding his son from those burdens, believing that one day he would step forward with gratitude. And now that same son sat pale and trembling, realizing he had been blind to the truth his entire life. Mr. Harris flipped to another section, employment contracts. He pointed out the clauses approved by the father's hand, the terms signed by Richard himself, acknowledging in writing the authority of the man he had just called useless. Richard's mouth opened in protest, but the words shriveled in his throat. Clara touched his arm, but her hand shook. The image of power she had married into was dissolving before her eyes, leaving nothing but humiliation. The lawyer's voice sharpened, recounting expansions into new markets, acquisitions that doubled their revenues, all greenlit by the father. He had built a silent empire, brick by brick, and now the walls of that empire towered over them, casting shadows that stretched across the table. Every arrogant word they had spoken turned to dust. Every laugh choked back into silence. The father's gaze swept over them, piercing, unrelenting. Richard couldn't meet his eyes. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his breath shallow, his shoulders hunched. For years they had believed themselves clever, superior heirs to a kingdom they didn't build. Now they sat exposed, naked in their ignorance, their arrogance stripped bare by ink and paper. Harris closed the folder with a snap, the sound final, unyielding. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead light. No one dared speak. Richard's jaw clenched, but his hands trembled against the armrests. Clara blinked rapidly, searching for words but finding none. Linda lowered her head as though hiding could shield her from the truth. And Mark, his son, stared at his father with eyes that finally began to see. The father did not look back at him with warmth or forgiveness. His stare was cold steel, a reflection of the betrayal that still burned. The balance of power had shifted. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. What remained was fear, raw and unmasked, curling in the corners of the room like smoke. They had thought him weak, irrelevant, expendable. Now they realized the truth. They had been living in the shadow of a man whose quiet power had controlled their world from the very beginning. The father adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, the smallest motion yet. It carried the weight of a hammer falling. It was not arrogance. It was certainty, a reminder that he had never lost control. His silence had not been surrender. It had been patience. They had mistaken humility for weakness, restraint for fragility. Now they saw what lay beneath, and it terrified them. Mr. Harris placed a second folder on the desk, thicker than the first bound, tight with string. He rested his hand on it, eyes fixed on Richard and Mark. He said there was much more details they hadn't considered, debts and decisions that would pull the rug from beneath them once again. Richard shifted, his breathing quickened, and Mark's lips parted, but no sound came out. They thought the storm had already struck. They were wrong. The worst was still to come, and the next revelation would crush whatever scraps of arrogance they still clung to. Mr. Harris untied the second folder, the one bound with string, and spread the papers across the desk with deliberate care. Each page landed like the strike of a gavel, heavy and unrelenting. The silence in the room deepened, broken only by the shuffle of paper and the shallow breaths of those who suddenly realized this wasn't over. It was only beginning. His voice, calm but razor-sharp, cut into the air as he revealed what lay beneath the empire's surface: debts. Not debts carried by the old man. Debts buried in the shadows by the very men who had mocked him. Richard's name was the first to surface. A loan of $50,000, hidden secret bleeding money for things that had nothing to do with business. A luxury car purchased under the company's credit, vacations disguised as business trips, and casino markers that had never been repaid. Richard's face collapsed as Harris read the details, each word peeling away the mask of respectability he had worn for years. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her polished nails trembling against her lips. She knew about the car, perhaps even suspected the trips, but the gambling was a blade she hadn't expected. The foundation of the life she had boasted about at dinner parties cracked beneath her feet. Then came Mark. The lawyer's tone didn't falter as he laid bare the betrayals committed by the son. $32,000 in unauthorized purchases, shop equipment ordered without approval, invoices padded and hidden, and worse still, a $45,000 down payment siphoned into a house he had no right to buy. Linda stiffened her face, paling, her eyes darting to Mark with a mixture of fury and disbelief. She whispered his name, but he wouldn't look at her. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the floor. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of it, the debts piling higher until the number stood like a death sentence: $187,000. The words hung in the air, suffocating. Richard shifted in his seat, sweat breaking across his forehead, his earlier bravado drowned under the weight of exposure. Clara's fingers clutched the edge of her chair as though holding on for balance. Linda sat rigid. Her breath caught her face, stripped of its practiced composure. And Mark, his shoulders hunched, his silence thicker than before. He had betrayed his father, not only with indifference but with theft, a theft that cut as deep as any word of mockery. The father did not move. He watched. He let the panic grow, let it spread across their faces like a storm cloud swallowing the horizon. He had given his son everything: time, sacrifice, love, and now the truth lay bare. His own blood had used that trust as currency. The stepson, so eager to wear the crown of success, had gambled away more than money. He had gambled his future. And the women who had joined their arrogance now sat pale and trembling, realizing the life they thought secure was crumbling into dust. Mr. Harris stacked the papers into neat piles, tapping them once against the desk as though closing the coffin on their illusions. His words carried no malice, only fact, and that made them more brutal. These debts were not accidents. They were choices. Each signature, each hidden withdrawal, each deceitful purchase was deliberate. They hadn't merely failed. They had stolen from the very man they ridiculed. Richard finally found his voice, though it cracked under the strain. He insisted it wasn't what it looked like, that the loans were temporary, that he had a plan. But his words dissolved into stammers as Harris slid the signed loan agreements across the desk, undeniable, final. Clara turned toward him, her expression shattering betrayal etched into every line of her face. The glamorous life she flaunted had been built on lies, and now those lies were dragging them all into ruin. Mark spoke next, his voice low, desperate. He said it wasn't theft. It was an investment, a way to build something for the future. But Harris was merciless. He flipped to the deed of the house, the check written from company accounts, the forged initials. Linda's sharp intake of breath filled the room. She pulled her hands back into her lap as if recoiling from the man she thought she knew. Her silence was heavier than any accusation. The father's eyes never left them. His gaze was steady, unwavering, cutting through their excuses like fire through dry wood. He did not speak, but his silence was its own kind of verdict. He had been humiliated, mocked, dismissed, but now he was the witness to their downfall. And it was their own actions, their own greed, that dragged them into the pit. The air thickened heavy with panic. Richard tugged at his collar. Clara blinked rapidly as though she might wake from a nightmare. Linda stared at her husband with hollow eyes, and Mark's hands trembled on his knees. Each of them had been stripped bare, their arrogance ripped away, their respectability revealed as nothing but a mask. Mr. Harris leaned back, folding his hands. His words were final, cold. The total stood at $187,000, a debt that was theirs alone to carry. Not the father's, not the estate's, theirs. Richard slumped back in his chair, his face pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Mark's lips moved as if to speak, but no words came out. Clara looked at the papers as though they were poison, and Linda pressed her hand to her temple, trying to hold herself together. The father finally drew a breath, slow and measured, and the sound of it was louder than their panic. His eyes moved from one face to the next, letting the silence crush them further. They had laughed at him, reduced him to nothing. But the truth had clawed its way into the light, and it had torn their world apart. And yet Mr. Harris was not finished. He tapped his finger on the unopened file still resting at the corner of his desk, heavier, thicker weighting. His eyes flicked to the father, then back to the broken figures across the table. What came next would make the debts look like a mere shadow of the reckoning that was about to unfold. They leaned forward almost in unison, desperation dripping from every word, every glance. Richard's voice cracked first, a pitiful plea that stumbled over excuses. He swore it wasn't as bad as it looked, that he could fix it if only he had a little more time, a little more grace. Clara clutched his arm, her painted nails digging into his sleeve, whispering that they could pay it back, that this didn't have to ruin them. Mark sat rigid, eyes hollow, and finally muttered that it was all just a misunderstanding. Linda, pale and trembling, begged for forgiveness with her silence, her hands knotted in her lap. The air in the office was heavy with their panic, thick with the stench of hypocrisy. The father didn't flinch. He let their words spill out one after another, a tide of excuses and desperate bargains. Minutes ago they had mocked him, laughed at him, reduced his years of labor to a cruel joke. They had called him useless, treated him like a burden unworthy of respect. Now their masks had shattered, and in the ruins of their arrogance they reached for the same man they had spat on. The shift was almost laughable if it hadn't burned so deep. He sat straighter, his voice finally breaking the silence, calm and sharp enough to cut glass. He reminded them of their cruelty, of the way their laughter had filled the room when they thought him powerless. He told them how quick they had been to dismiss him, to strip him of dignity, to act as though his life's work had been a trivial hobby. And now, with their secrets laid bare, they dared to call him family again, as if blood erased betrayal, as if desperation could wash away the contempt they had poured over him moments before. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the father's gaze pinned him where he sat. Clara shifted her shoulders, trembling, her breath catching in her throat. Mark finally looked at his father, truly looked at him, and in that gaze there was no defiance left, only the hollow echo of shame. The hypocrisy was too much to bear. They wanted mercy from the man they had branded a fool. They wanted protection from the same hands they had mocked as too weak to matter. The father refused. Not with anger, not with raised voice or harsh gestures, but with something colder, heavier. He simply said no. No more shielding, no more covering their sins, no more rescuing them from the fires they had lit themselves. Every debt they had taken, every lie they had signed, every reckless gamble they had made, they would answer for all of it. His words were steady, deliberate, the sound of a verdict delivered without hesitation. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard slumped back in his chair, his confidence evaporated, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Clara's eyes darted wildly, searching for some crack in the verdict, some weakness to exploit, but there was none. Linda's lips quivered as though she might speak, but she swallowed the words before they escaped. Mark pressed his palms against his knees, staring down at the carpet as though the fibers could hide him from the weight of his father's rejection. The lawyer's presence only deepened the severity. Mr. Harris sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. There would be no rescue here, no softening of the blow. The documents lay spread across the desk like evidence in a trial, and the jury had already spoken. The father's memory flashed with images, the years of sacrifice, of missed meals, of back-breaking work under the summer sun. He thought of how many times he had chosen to go without so his son could have more. He remembered how he had taught Mark to drive, how he had carried Richard when he was too young to walk home. Every choice had been a gift. Every sacrifice had been for them. And this was how they repaid him, by treating him like nothing, by hiding debts and laughing at his worth. That wound cut deeper than money ever could. And yet, as he sat in that office, he felt no temptation to forgive. Mercy without consequence would only feed their arrogance, would teach them that betrayal could always be undone with enough begging. They needed to face the truth, the weight of responsibility pressing down until they either broke or changed. He would not rob them of that reckoning. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder each second, marking the distance between who they thought he was and who he truly was. The father's face was calm, his voice low, his words sharp. He told them they had built this ruin themselves. He told them that blood ties do not excuse theft, that family does not erase betrayal, that respect is earned, not demanded when convenient. Every word struck harder than the last, each syllable tightening the noose of reality around their throats. Richard's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. Clara's mascara streaked as she whispered frantic plans that sounded more like prayers. Linda sat motionless, her silence more damning than any confession. And Mark, his son, his blood looked as though he might crumble where he sat. His voice broke as he tried to say the word Dad, but the father cut him off with a single glance. That word no longer held the power it once did. The room felt colder, sharper, the shadows stretching long across the floor as the late afternoon sun dipped lower. The reckoning was not just about money. It was about truth, about dignity, about the line that had been crossed and could never be uncrossed. They wanted relief, but what they received was reality, and reality was merciless. Mr. Harris placed his hand on yet another folder, heavier still, a signal that the storm had not passed. The father's silence returned, unyielding, his eyes locked on the broken faces across from him. What came next would not only seal their fate, but carve it into stone, a judgment they would carry long after the debts had been paid. The reckoning was not over, it had only just begun. The room was already drowning in the weight of exposed debts when Mr. Harris calmly reached for yet another file, his fingers tapping the cover as though to warn them of the storm waiting inside. He pulled it open with the same quiet authority that had already gutted their arrogance, and this time his voice carried an edge of finality. The so-called plants they had ridiculed, the flowers and shrubs they had mocked as a foolish pastime of an aging man, were not just decorative greenery. They were the foundation of a thriving enterprise, Evergreen Gardens, valued at $2.4 million, with a distribution network worth another $800,000 attached like arteries to its beating heart. The words hit harder than any accusation. Richard's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Clara blinked rapidly, her lashes trembling as if each blink might erase what she had heard. Linda shifted in her chair, her breath catching in her throat, and Mark, his own son, stared at the papers like a man who had just discovered the earth beneath him wasn't solid after all. Their earlier laughter, their smug dismissal of roses for bread, now twisted into silence, so profound it screamed louder than any insult. For decades, while they rolled their eyes at his gardening, while they whispered behind his back about wasted time and foolish hobbies, he had been quietly laying bricks for an empire. Each seed planted, each ledger balanced, each contract signed was another stone in the foundation they had never noticed. He had worked through blistering summers, through winters that cracked his skin, through long nights when they slept soundly. And all the while he allowed them to believe he was fading, irrelevant, preoccupied with soil and blossoms. Richard finally broke the silence, stammering something about exaggeration, that surely these valuations were inflated. Harris didn't even look at him as he slid certified appraisals across the desk, each one stamped dated undeniable. The numbers glared from the page like judgment written in fire. Clara's face drained, her lips parting in disbelief. She had married into what she thought was security, but she had never understood where the real power lay. Linda pressed her hands together, eyes wet, realizing that the man she had stood silently against was the very one who had been holding their world together. The father sat motionless, his silence a throne from which he ruled the room. For years they had painted him as weak, fragile, a relic clinging to a past that no longer mattered. But here now the mask fell away, and what remained was the truth. He was the architect of their lives, the unseen force behind their comfort, the guardian of the fortune they had mistaken for theirs. He didn't need to boast or explain. The numbers spoke for him, cold and undeniable. Mark's lips finally moved, his voice barely above a whisper. He asked why keep it hidden? Why let them believe he was powerless? The father's eyes flicked to his son, and for a moment the weight of years pressed between them. Nights at the dinner table, birthdays forgotten, the hollow silence that had grown like ivy around their relationship. He did not answer. The silence was heavier than words, a silence that told Mark the truth: he hadn't been kept in the dark by accident. He had been blind by choice, too arrogant to see what was in front of him. Richard leaned forward, desperate now, his words tumbling over themselves, promises of loyalty, of partnership, of respect. But the desperation was hollow, transparent. Clara nodded frantically, her voice high and brittle, urging the father to understand, to see that they could work together, that the past could be forgotten. Their sudden submission reeked of fear, not love, of greed, not respect. And the father saw through it, saw every thread of their desperation, every fracture in their resolve. The air in the office had shifted. What had once been heavy with humiliation and panic was now electric with revelation. The father no longer sat as the victim of their cruelty. He sat as the emperor of an empire they had mocked into existence. The walls seemed taller, the light harsher, the silence louder. They had thought him powerless. They had thought him irrelevant. Now they realized they had been living under his shadow every step of their lives, tied to the man they had treated as disposable. He thought back to the countless mornings when he rose before dawn, when he turned soil while the world still slept, when his back ached, but his resolve held firm. He thought of the quiet deals struck over coffee, the suppliers who trusted his word, the workers who respected his discipline. All those years they had laughed at his boots, caked in mud, at his hands stained with earth. And yet those hands had built something larger than their shallow imaginations could ever grasp. Richard's voice cracked again, begging for a share, pleading that family should mean forgiveness, that they could rebuild together. Clara added her chorus, her tone sickly sweet, trying to disguise greed with affection. Mark lowered his head, unable to look at the man he had betrayed, his silence finally shifting from arrogance to shame. Linda whispered his name, but he didn't move. The father inhaled his breath. Steady controlled his eyes, sweeping over them with the calm of a man who no longer needed to prove himself. They had revealed themselves fully, greedy, reckless, hypocritical, and he had revealed himself too, not as the frail burden they imagined, but as the quiet storm that had always held the power. Mr. Harris closed the file with a sharp snap, the sound reverberating through the room like the closing of a vault door. He glanced at the father, then back at the pale, trembling faces across from him. There was still more to come, more truths buried in ink and paper, more revelations waiting to turn their panic into despair. The father remained still, the faintest trace of a smile curving his lips. They thought they had seen the full extent of his power. They hadn't. The next revelation would strike like lightning, splitting what remained of their pride into ashes. The father let the silence stretch until the air in the office felt heavy enough to crush them. Their eyes darted back and forth, waiting for him to speak, waiting for some glimmer of mercy that would undo the nightmare unfolding before them. But when his voice finally came, it was not mercy they heard. It was a sentence cold and deliberate, shaped with the precision of a blade. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sweeping across Richard, Clara, Mark, and Linda, pinning them in place. He spoke with calm authority, each word measured, each pause sharpening the sting. The debts, the lies, the mockery, all of it could be reduced. The total that hung over their heads like a guillotine could be cut down from $187,000 to $50,000. But the cost of that reduction was not written in money. It was written in humility. They would work for him, not as partners, not as heirs, but as laborers. For 8 years they would earn nothing more than minimum wage, stripped of the luxury and arrogance they had wrapped themselves in for so long. They would live not in the houses they bought with stolen money or flaunted with pride, but in his old house, the modest home they once dismissed as beneath them. And every morning before their day began, they would face him, look him in the eye, and apologize. Not with excuses, not with half-truths, but with words that acknowledged every insult, every betrayal, every wound they had carved into him. The conditions fell like hammer strikes, and with each one the walls of their dignity crumbled further. Richard's face twisted with disbelief, a flush rising up his neck. He stammered that it was unreasonable, that no man could demand such humiliation. Clara gasped, clutching his arm, her polished exterior shattering into desperation. Linda shook her head slowly, her lips parting, but no words emerging. And Mark. His son sat frozen, eyes locked on his father with a mixture of shame and something darker, a wounded pride that bled into fear. The father did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His calmness was more terrifying than anger, his stillness more crushing than any outburst. He reminded them that this was not revenge. Revenge would have been easy, walking away, letting the debts drown them, watching as the weight of their recklessness destroyed them. No, this was justice. This was balance restored. For every insult a price, for every betrayal a cost. They had chosen greed over loyalty, mockery over respect, arrogance over humility. Now they would learn what it meant to live without the mask. Mr. Harris said nothing. His presence was a quiet endorsement, his stillness the seal of legality behind every word spoken. The conditions were real, enforceable, binding. The father had thought this through, not in haste, not in anger, but with the clarity of a man who had carried the weight of silence long enough. Richard's voice rose louder this time, shaking with desperation. He said it was unfair that no man should wield such power over his family. But his words only betrayed his weakness. He had been happy to wield cruelty when he thought he was on top. He had laughed, mocked, dismissed. Fairness had never mattered to him until now, when the scale tipped against him. Clara begged then, her voice high, almost frantic. She painted visions of ruin, of lost reputation, of shame among their friends. She reached for pity, for softness, for anything that might bend the father's resolve. But he didn't move. He didn't blink. He had watched them wield shame as a weapon. Now it was theirs to carry. Mark finally spoke, his voice low, trembling, addressing his father with a weight that sounded almost like the boy he once was. He said it was too much, that the conditions would break them, that surely there was another way. But the father's eyes met his, cold and steady, and the truth in them left no space for argument. Mark had stood silent while the insults rained down, had chosen cowardice when his father needed courage. This was the cost of that silence. The office was suffocating with the weight of the decision. The clock ticked louder each second, a reminder that the offer would not stand forever. The father leaned back in his chair, folding his hands, and gave them a time limit. 5 minutes. 5 minutes to decide whether they would accept justice or collapse under the full weight of their debts. The panic was immediate. Clara whispered furiously to Richard, her words sharp and frantic. Linda sat pale, her eyes darting toward Mark, waiting for him to lead, but he sat hollow, his pride and shame battling silently. Richard's face flushed red. His jaw clenched, his hands trembling as he weighed humiliation against ruin. The father watched them all, his silence as steady as stone, the faintest shadow of a smile curving his lips. This was not about money anymore. It was about power, about truth, about dignity reclaimed. For years they had believed him weak, irrelevant, disposable. Now they sat cornered, their futures bound by the very man they had tried to erase. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, the sound jolting them like a gunshot. 4 minutes left. Richard cursed under his breath. Clara pleaded. Linda's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Mark's shoulders sagged under the weight of inevitability. Their arrogance had built the cage. Now they were trapped inside it. The father's gaze never wavered. He did not gloat, did not sneer. He simply waited, steady and unyielding, as the seconds bled away. They thought they had seen the depths of his control, but the true reckoning was yet to come, and what awaited them after their decision would carve the final shape of their downfall. The ticking of the clock grew louder with every passing second, a metronome of doom echoing through the lawyer's office. 5 minutes, that was all they had been given. 5 minutes to decide whether they would accept the sentence laid before them, or be crushed under the full weight of their ruin. The father sat motionless, his eyes fixed on them, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to speak. The silence itself was a verdict pressing down on them harder than any words could. Richard was the first to crack. His voice rose sharp with desperation, the bravado long gone. He swore he would work, that he would swallow the insult, but begged for some adjustment, anything that would let him cling to a shred of pride. His pleas rang hollow, bouncing off the walls like the whimper of a man cornered. Clara clutched at his arm, tears streaking her carefully painted face, her mascara smudging into black rivers. She whispered frantic bargains, promises to do better, to be loyal, to never again speak a word of mockery. The words spilled out fast, desperate, the sound of someone drowning. Across from them, Linda sat rigid, her hands folded tight in her lap. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she turned to Mark, searching for some last flicker of leadership, some trace of the man she thought she married. But Mark was broken. His shoulders sagged, his head hung low, and his lips quivered as he muttered agreement to the terms. His voice was so low it barely carried a whisper that surrendered what little dignity he had left. His father's gaze cut into him, and he could not hold it. Shame bowed his head lower, pressing him into the role of a man who had failed, not just in loyalty, but in courage. Mr. Harris slid the papers forward, the contracts that would bind them tighter than any iron chain. His voice was measured, deliberate, reminding them of the clauses, the signatures required, the penalties for breaking their word. Richard hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the pen. The father said nothing, watching as the stepson who once sneered at him now shook like a child forced to confess. Finally, Richard scrawled his name across the page, the ink trembling, the arrogance drained out of every stroke. Clara sobbed quietly beside him, her hand covering her mouth as though she could hide the sound of her own humiliation. Mark stared at the paper in front of him, his hand frozen. The silence dragged out long and suffocating. His wife whispered his name, urging him to sign, to accept what was inevitable. At last, with tears brimming in his eyes, he lowered the pen to the page. The sound of it scratching across the paper was the sound of defeat, the collapse of a man who had once laughed at the thought of his father's irrelevance. Now every line of his signature was a surrender, an acknowledgement that the man he had betrayed had become his judge, jury, and executioner. Linda signed after him, her hand steady but her face pale, the look of a woman resigned to chains she had not expected to wear. Clara followed her signature, jagged, her tears dripping onto the page and smearing the ink. Each name added to the paper was another nail sealing the coffin of their arrogance. The contracts lay complete, their signatures binding them to the very man they had mocked, their fates no longer in their own hands. The father leaned back, his face calm, his eyes cold. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The sight of them slumped in their chairs, their faces hollow, their eyes wet, was satisfaction enough. They looked like prisoners awaiting transport, their once proud expressions shattered into masks of defeat. The silence in the room now belonged to him, not the kind of silence they once mistook for weakness, but the silence of absolute control. Mr. Harris gathered the contracts, stacking them neatly, his movements precise. He bound them with a clip and set them aside with finality. The deal was sealed. No words, no pleas, no outbursts could undo it now. Richard rubbed his temples, muttering curses under his breath. Clara sniffled, her shoulders shaking. Linda sat with her hands clenched, her face turned toward the floor. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes, red lips pressed tight, the weight of his father's power bearing down until he could barely breathe. The father finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and merciless. He told them their freedom had ended the moment their signatures touched the page. They had traded arrogance for servitude, pride for chains. Every morning they would rise not as masters of their own lives, but as laborers under his command. They would earn scraps, live in his old house, and choke down the taste of humiliation with every apology. And they would do it for 8 long years. His words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. Each one landed like a hammer on stone. The clock ticked on, but time felt frozen. They had thought themselves heirs to an empire, rulers in waiting. Now they were workers bound by the ink of their own names, trapped in the prison of their greed. Richard's hands still shook. Clara's sobs still broke the silence. Mark sat in stillness, his shame a heavier weight than chains, and the father watched calm and steady, reclaiming every ounce of dignity they had once tried to strip away. Mr. Harris placed the contracts in his briefcase, the snap of the lock ringing out like the final clang of a cell door. The deal was done. The father's empire was secure, his power undeniable, their humiliation permanent. They had chosen this not by chance, but by arrogance, by greed, by betrayal. And now they would live with it every day. The father stood slowly, adjusting his cuff, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He looked down at them, one by one, his eyes unflinching. They could not meet his gaze. Their heads hung low, their pride gone, their futures no longer their own. Without another word, he turned toward the door, the echo of his footsteps carrying the weight of victory. And yet even this was not the end. The contracts were only the beginning. What awaited them outside that office, under the weight of public humiliation and daily servitude, would carve them into something unrecognizable. The reckoning had bound them, but what came next would break them. Months slipped by like shadows moving across the floor of his new office, but to the father each day was a monument to the truth finally revealed. The empire they had mocked as nothing more than flowers had crowned him again, not with vanity or noise, but with something sharper, vindication. The executive office sat high above the city, the walls lined with polished wood and shelves stacked with contracts, ledgers, and the evidence of his life's work. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the yard below where his son and stepson bent under the weight of their humiliation. Richard, once arrogant enough to laugh at the reading of a will, now staggered through the mud, carrying pots heavier than the pride he had lost. The rain clung to his face, streaking down his neck, his expensive suits long replaced with worn work clothes that stank of soil and sweat. Clara no longer clung to him with her bright, brittle smile. She had grown quiet. Her eyes dulled, her laughter gone. She stood under the canopy, watching with the hollow stare of a woman who once thought she had married into power, but now found herself tethered to servitude. Mark fared no better. His hands, once soft from neglecting real labor, shook as they scrubbed the rust from tools. His shoulders hunched, his breath ragged. Linda stood by in silence. Her once proud composure eroded into something brittle and fragile. Each morning before the work began, she stood beside her husband and joined in the ritual apology. It was not the words themselves that stung, but the repetition, the ritual of swallowing pride with the dawn. They spoke them not as family, not as equals, but as penitents kneeling before the man they had scorned. The father watched all of it from above. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It had become the crown of his reign. For 25 years he had carried the empire quietly, allowing his wife's face to stand in the spotlight, allowing his children to believe they held the reins. For 25 years he had been invisible in their eyes. But now, every drop of rain that soaked their clothes, every scrape of their hands against steel, every word of apology wrung from their throats was proof that invisibility had been his weapon, patience, his sharpest blade. He remembered the insults, the laughter at the lawyer's office, the smirks when Richard suggested he sell roses for bread, the nods of agreement from those who claimed to love him. Each word had burned, then cutting into him like fire, but now they fueled him. He didn't need to raise his voice or deliver speeches. He had bound them with their own signatures, locked them into a cage they had built with arrogance and greed, and now he simply let time do its work. The workers around the yard respected him. They saw the truth in his stillness, the quiet authority that required no theatrics. They nodded when he passed, their eyes sharp with recognition. They knew who had built the empire, who had carried it on his shoulders, and now they knew who held it in his grip. Respect was not demanded. It was given freely from those who had seen enough men fall to know what true strength looked like. Richard glanced up once, his back straining under the weight of the pots. His eyes flicked toward the office window, toward the figure watching above. For just a heartbeat, the arrogance of old flared in his gaze, the defiance of a man who hated the chains he wore. But it faded as quickly as it came. He bent back to his work, the weight pressing him down again. Mark, too, raised his head as he scrubbed the tools, his hands trembling, his face flushed with shame. He mouthed the word "Dad" once, a whisper carried away by the rain, but the father did not move. He watched, steady, unyielding, until Mark dropped his gaze once more. Every day the apologies came. They lined up, voices, breaking words, spilling out like a penance they could never escape. They repeated the insults they had once hurled at him and replaced them with regret, their voices hollow, their pride stripped bare. It was not revenge that filled the father's heart in those moments. It was justice. Revenge is born of anger, but justice is born of truth. And this truth was unshakable. The man they had mocked, dismissed, and discarded had been their master all along. The rain tapped harder against the glass, streaking down in crooked lines. The father leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, his hands folded across his chest. The years of silence had not been wasted. They had been a weapon sharp and patient, waiting for the moment to strike. Now that strike was complete, not with blood or fire, but with chains of ink and paper, with contracts and confessions, with the steady grind of humiliation that no storm could wash away. He looked out again, watching Richard stumble, watching Mark scrub, listening in his mind to the apologies they would deliver at dawn tomorrow and the day after and every day for 8 long years. Dignity was his again, not because it had been given, but because he had taken it back piece by piece until nothing of their mockery remained. For 25 years he had been invisible. Now he was undeniable. And this was only the beginning. Stay with him until the end of this story to witness how a father's quiet patience became the most powerful revenge of all. Life has a way of revealing the truth when patience holds steady. The story reminds us that dignity is not something others grant. It is something we guard within ourselves, even when the world tries to strip it away. For years the father was underestimated, dismissed as weak, mocked for what others could not see. Yet his quiet perseverance, his discipline, and his refusal to surrender built a foundation stronger than arrogance could ever imagine. The lesson is simple but powerful. True strength does not need to shout. It grows in silence, in persistence, in the choices we make every day, to keep moving forward even when others doubt us. For those in their later years of life, this message carries deep meaning. Your value is not defined by age, by wealth, or by the recognition of others. It is defined by the resilience you carry, the wisdom you hold, and the justice you can deliver when the time is right. Patience is not weakness, it is the ultimate power. If this story resonates with you, subscribe now and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and your wisdom may inspire someone else today.